This podcast from News Talk WHCU is sponsored by Brightworks Computer Consulting. Call 277-8585. With your Friday Morning News Watch, I'm Lee Rayburn, and we are joined this morning by local author Marc Catone. His latest book, Until the Birds Chirp, Reflections on the 60s, which you can find online anytime at Amazon.com. And there's also a Facebook page as well, which you will find Until the Birds Chirp at Facebook.com. Marc, thanks for being here. And what made you write this story of the 60s?
Well, for many years, I had seen books and also film and TV shows of the 60s, and they always had the same famous, well-known people that were doing them. And I thought, well, how about someone, an average 60s person like myself, to do a book and describe how most kids grew up in the 60s, because I was a teen during the 60s, and what they related to and how each event and episode and movement of the 60s affected them and in their later lives as well.
How would you define the 60s from your experience?
It was like a hothouse of ideas going on in the 60s, culturally, politically, socially, sexually, all sorts of different angles going on. And people coped with it in different ways. And one of the reasons that I did the book as well is I was hoping that my book might set a precedent, that it might influence other people like myself to write their stories, because I'm just one in a million of people that experienced the 60s.
Lived through it. Survived it. And have a story or two to tell about it.
Right, exactly. So I hope that people like it. I try to have a folksy narrative so they would enjoy what's going on and also influence others to do the same.
But why not the 70s? And I know that was your 20s and you were already, a grown man. But what was it about the 60s? And I can look back historically and see the changes that were occurring. Yeah. But you're just a kid. You probably weren't paying attention to all those changes, at least not at the outset when the 60s began.
I was the kind of kid, maybe nerdy in one way, that when things were actually going on during the 60s, I made a mental note, hey, remember this, because someday it's going to be important. So, and my relatives and friends were always going, hey, Marc, do you remember when that happened? And I, like a little computer, I'd press something on the side of my head and I'd say, oh, yeah, we did that in 1967, 1968, and so on. But the 70s were quite different. For me, it was after the 60s were actually over, had to get a job, got married, moved around. There were more responsibilities than there were when I was a kid and also in college. So that was the big difference between the 60s and 70s for me.
It would have been a good time to have few responsibilities.
Oh, I had a great time. I had a great time during the 70s. I should probably do a book about that, but that would be much different than the one I just did.
Yeah, it would be about family life, work life, and getting by. How do you, when you talk about the 60s, you're not talking about 1960 to 1970. For you, it's sort of a different purview.
Yes, I consider the 60s, not the numerals, but the letters, SIXTIES, to actually be like a cultural, social, cultural decade between approximately, and these are arbitrary, 1963 to 1973. And 63, to me, I turned 13. Martin Luther King did his famous I've Got a Dream speech the month I turned 13. JFK was killed. The Beatles came 2 months later. So that was sort of like the beginning of the 60s for me. And the end of it, again, arbitrary as well, was around 1973 or 74. Nixon resignation, Watergate, the first Arab oil embargo, inflation becoming a reality that hit my generation really hard as we were entering the workforce. So.
Sure. And so you define it as two cornerstones of history, very difficult cornerstones, with the assassination of a president and the removal of the president.
Yeah, exactly.
But you've also written a book about the Beatles called As I Write This Letter, detailing some of the fan letters from the Beatles. You are, I believe, a Beatlemaniac?
I would say so. It's a rare disease, but it's enjoyable.
So when it comes time to putting on a Beatles album, first, do you still have the albums? The actual album?
Do. I do have all the albums in orangewood boxes in my study.
So when it comes time for Marc Catone, the author of Until the Birds Chirp, Reflections on the 60s, goes to turn on his Beatles album, what's your go-to?
Sgt. Pepper.
Okay.
Sgt. Pepper was a major...
We would have accepted multiple answers for that question, but that one was one of them.
And you could ask me tomorrow, and I'd probably tell you a different answer. The White Album or whatever.
So did you get to see the Beatles?
I did. I was very fortunate. Me and thousands of others got to see the Beatles at Shea Stadium.
Which brings up the next question. Were you able to hear the Beatles?
Yes.
Really?
Well, just to step back a second, there were two Beatles concerts at Shea Stadium. The big famous one was the one in 1965 that they made the film from, and everybody talks about. There was 55,000 people there and so forth. They did it again the second year, which was 1966. And in fact, this year is the 50th anniversary of the very last Beatles concert anywhere.
Wow.
Which was Candlestick Park in San Francisco. But to answer your question, because I was a guy and I wasn't screaming myself, I had an advantage over the girls who, when they screamed, they drowned themselves out.
Yes.
But the first year I went, I was way up in nosebleed country. And if you ever remember Shea Stadium, the third deck, they looked like ants. And in fact, when they started, no one knew what they were singing. It was Twist and Shout, but nobody knew what they were singing. But the second year was great. I had field level seats.
Oh, wow.
I could see them, well, not like I'm looking at you right now, but, off in the distance a little bit.
You could tell the different faces.
And I could hear them a lot better. There were less fans that year. There was a couple of controversies going on with the Beatles that year. John Lennon saying the Beatles were more popular than Jesus and different things like that. They kept some people away, or some people's parents kept their kids away.
Did not keep you away.
Did not keep me away.
I don't think anything
And I could hear much better. I remember distinctly hearing If I Needed Someone and Nowhere Man and things of that nature.
Do you see music mirroring its times and culture in which it's in the same way today as you did during that era?
Well, I am not as astute on today's music as I
Me neither.
should be. I have a daughter who's 30, and she was very heavily into rap and still is. So I do see that aspect of it, yes, but I would not portray myself as someone that's that knowledgeable about today's music to really answer your question.
Marc Catone's the author of Until the Birds Chirp. You've been an Ithacan for almost 40 years
Yes.
now, and you can find this book online anytime at Amazon.com. Was there a high point and low point for you between 63 and 73? Were there those moments of perilousness where you didn't know where you were going to go?
Well, yes. I would say when I got out of college in 1972, I graduated from Western Connecticut State in Danbury, Connecticut. That was when the inflationary times sort of hit, and we were all prepared with our liberal arts education, and then all of a sudden people were starting to do these new things with computers.
Yeah.
And nobody was trained in them yet.
Yeah.
So I had a little bit of a problem finding a job right away, and I also had met my wife, my then fiance at school, and we were wanting to get married. So we actually got engaged, and I had no job.
And she still said yes?
She still said yes. She had no job either, but
I was just about ready to give you credit,
Right.
Mark, but forget that. What about the high point for you?
the high point. Well, the whole, I would say the middle, my favorite period is the middle 60s.
Why?
Because of the music mostly, and because of discovering myself as a writer. Even when I was 16, I would write things for friends and knock off different things for them. And I started being influenced by various books and got really interested in literature, especially Truman Capote's In Cold Blood really influenced me a lot.
Wow.
Reading that book. It wasn't on the school's required book list, but
Right.
I read it anyway.
So there is this aspect of creativity from the 60s.
Oh, yeah.
That is output of creativity that obviously inspired you.
You know, it's hard to translate into words this feeling, but I think I can speak on behalf of a lot of people who lived then, that when during the 60s you felt like anything could happen. And I mean for the good. Anything could happen. You were able to do anything you wanted. You had a clean slate every time you woke up, and this was going to be your day.
I can't imagine what that headspace would be like, because that's a far cry from where most folks wake up today and
I know.
roll their eyes and drag themselves out of bed and wonder what's going to hit them upside the head on this day.
It is quite different today.
Is there something we can learn from that era that we should be thinking about and bringing to the fore in our current era?
I think you have to live your own life. I think you still have to, if you want to march to the beat of a different drummer, you still need to do that. One of the things about the book that I emphasize is that the 60s generation, as I call us, we're still alive and well. People are living longer. we're not quite over yet, which is what the Until the Birds Chirp means.
We're not over yet.
Yeah, Until the Birds Chirp is sort of a, you like that, huh?
I do. We're not done yet.
No.
Which is great.
My Until the Birds Chirp is sort of like what some people say until the fat lady sings.
Cows come home.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So, we're not done yet. We still have some life left in us.
That is reassuring to hear because it was an era unlike any other. And this story recounts Marc Catone's experience with the 60s and the reflections on the era. You don't strike me as a hippie.
Well,
did anybody ever call Marc Catone a hippie?
My father.
Well, what did he know?
Yeah, what did he know? Yes, relatives called me. I had my hair fairly long. In 1972, I was very hippie-ish. I was the head of the students from McGovern on my campus.
Oh, wow.
And that's how I met my wife. We met in New Hampshire. We were working for the New Hampshire primary in 1972. And yes, I was very hippie-ish then.
That just opens up a whole nother line of questioning about the current political era, but we'll save that for another day, Mark.
Yeah.
Bite your tongue, sir.
Don't get me started.
Marc Catone, local author of Until the Birds Chirp, Reflections on the 60s. Pick it up today at Amazon.com. It's available for you now. Mark, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
I really had a great time.